Hello, I want to take this opportunity of Inside the Lords to have a cigarette in my hand, but really it's because we've got the chance to film through, and you can see the smoking area that the Lords go to. As you can see, it's completely undignified behind the bike shed, literally. And why I'm drawing your attention to that is because I've had to listen to quite a lot of nannying lectures this week inside the Lords, and one of the things is that they're going to adopt smoke-free UK by 2030. And to be honest, those who think there's one rule for them and one rule for us, let me tell you, they treat smokers like dirt in the Lords just as much as they do outside the Lords. So now we're going to go and sit on the bench. Hello everyone, it's a shorter week than usual in the Lords this week because today is the last day of this week. They're going into recess for a sort of half term, so they're rushing things through. I'm actually going home early as well because I'm going to go and write my lecture, and my lecture is for the weekend's event called the Academy, which is online, looking at elite institutions, the changing of the guard of the elite, and I'm particularly looking at the stonewalling of institutions, how institutions have been taken over by different interest groups, whether it's on the trans question, whether it's on the race question, whether it's on the green question. And I'm very anxious and nervous about doing the lecture, but I'm also very honoured to be invited to do it. So I'd like to encourage you to do that. Do sign up and join us online on Saturday from 12:30. But anyway, what's been happening inside the Lords? I really only want to refer to a couple of things that have happened this week because there hasn't been that much. The police and crime bill trundles on. There's been lots of amendments. People have been in the chamber till midnight. I haven't, because I'm trying to only choose to speak on the amendments that really matter to me, or that I think I can contribute something different. And that's been one of my rules of thumb since I've arrived. There's no point just speaking for the sake of it, but trying to make a bit of a difference when I do. So in fact, the amendments that I thought were going to emerge tonight, and the reason I'm going home early, are actually now not happening until next Monday. But do look out for them because they're very important. One is on the whether women's prisons should retain as women's prisons, because a recent court ruling has argued that in fact anyone who declares themselves a woman, even if born a man, can now be housed in a women's prison. And there's an amendment on that which I'm determined to speak on, and that will be interesting. There's also the attempt at introducing amendments to make misogyny a hate crime on Monday, and I will be opposing that. I appreciate that's going to be controversial, but there's quite a lot of interest in that amendment on Monday. And there'll also be discussions on indefinite sentences, which I do think are an egregious attack on civil liberties. And although I haven't planned a speech on that, I'm going to be listening carefully and see if I can contribute anything constructively on the question. And that's before we ever get to the whole controversy of the police and crime bill, which will be the protesting issue. And so I think that my life is going to have made somewhat of a misery on the protest question because of the nature of recent protests. Most recently, in fact, last night at the London School of Economics, when there was a speech by the Israeli ambassador to the UK, and regardless of what you think of ambassadors or what you think of Israel, it seemed to me to chase the female ambassador from Israel out in such an aggressive fashion by the students was, to say the least, making an exception of Israel, and also the kind of protest which is going to be raised as an excuse by the government to clamp down on protests. I will not allow that to be used. I will still defend their right to protest, but I do not support what they were protesting over in that instance. And there is a thin line sometimes between protest and harassment, and it's going to be a difficult question that I'm going to have to deal with in the next fortnight or so. The other thing that I wanted to really refer to has been, there's been two instances where anyone who thinks that the scandal in Parliament here is to do with having second jobs, is to do with people being paid too much for lobbying, all of which, by the way, I feel very uncomfortable with. I understand why people are concerned about the Owen Paterson question, or the way that was used by the government. Typical cowardice of the government, which was to, on the one hand, force people to vote one way and then change their mind the next morning. The whole question is just obviously leaves a nasty taste. But we haven't had a chance in the Lords to discuss this, but I wanted to raise something very important, which is the greatest corruption of the last, 5 or 6 years. The place where you really did feel as though the House of Lords was absolutely, not a place where any decision should be taken, was when members of Parliament, both elected and particularly unelected, tried to do something that was corrupt. That was, they tried to orchestrate in plain sight a coup against democracy. And that was, they tried to organise to overturn the sovereign will of the British people by trying to stop Brexit. Now you might think, why is she always going on about Brexit? Well, I'll tell you one of the reasons. One of the questions in the House of Lords just this week, even though I'd had to listen to be sanctimonious about corruption in the Parliament, one of the questions this week was how we can resolve the problem of the au pair crisis. There's a problem apparently that au pairs aren't able to get visas from European Union member states, and this apparently is creating some havoc. This was actually raised by a Conservative peer, a Baroness, who's a Remainer, and backed up with some glee and enthusiasm by the Lib Dem Labour pact that one would call the Remainer Alliance. And they went on and on about how this proved what a disaster it was that we'd left the European Union. I gave a very, very loud hear, hear to Lord Lilly, Peter Lilly, who stood up and drew attention to the fact that it might not go down so well with the British public, that the greatest excuse for why we should have stayed in the European Union was a matter of, as he put it, not being able to get the right servants. There was some huffing and puffing, but actually that's what it was about. But also, Lord Moylan made the point, asked the Minister in fact, to clarify and said, is it not the case that au pairs can come from anywhere in the world now? That there's no ban on au pairs, and the Minister clarified that indeed this is true. That those people who were saying, as one Lord said, we had a very lovely Swedish au pair and we learnt a lot about Sweden, we taught her English, and this was all part of a youth campaign. The Minister rightly pointed out, well, you can have au pairs from Sweden or anywhere else in the world, because all that's happened is that the British people have decided to leave the European Union, and now members from people from the European Union who want to be au pairs don't get preferential treatment. You can get an au pair from anywhere. You can get a visa for au pair from anywhere. But honestly, talk about tone deaf. And we've also just had Lord Frost giving his report back on the Northern Irish Protocol and how things are going with the EU. And I sat behind the Labour benches as in my usual position, and they were absolutely baying for blood. And all they kept arguing was a pro-EU position. And again, making the point this was why Brexit is such a disaster. So if you think that I go on about Brexit sometimes, or that I draw attention to the fact that they tried to overturn that vote, it's because actually in the House of Lords, there are still people who are trying to overturn the democratic wishes of the British people. And that's the greatest corruption, the greatest scandal, the greatest affront to democracy, I think, than any kind of, cash for lobbying scandals, even though I don't approve of them before anyone starts saying I do. That's on that. The other thing that's happened this week, which I think was interesting and relates actually to this lecture I'm doing for the Academy at the weekend, was that a group of us actually joined in a question put by the Labour peer, Lord Treisman, which was about transgender people participating in sport, and how trans women had actually been allowed to participate in women's sports, and how that was unfair because they have the male advantage physically. And if sport is nothing else, it's a physical activity, it's to do with the body, and consequently it's not just the testosterone but the fact that you have a larger heart, that you actually have different upper body size as a consequence of being a man. And then you can declare that you are a woman, and that should be respected in terms of your identity, that's fine. But you can't then join the women's category of sport, because sport, if nothing else, is not just physical and to do with your body, but it's also to do with having fair, level playing field. And it is obviously not fair. But there was quite a lot of people who spoke on that question. It's caused something of a stir. And it was interesting that the one or two people who were part of the trans activist lobby on this question didn't even refer directly to the sport question, but basically made a point which was particularly irritating in the circumstances of saying that trans people now feel under threat because of the toxic mood in the UK. And of course there was a great irony there, because if there's been a toxic mood in the UK, it has to have been created by those who try and close down any discussion on the trans issue. And it was good to be in a position where across the House, Labour, Lib Dem, Tories were actually arguing on that question in support of women's rights and the fact that born women should have a special category for sport, which is pretty obvious to me. I also went to, and this is the final point that I'll make, a gathering of people who were interested in actually opposing the assisted dying bill. And of course, you know, people will have different views who watch Inside the Lords. Not everyone agrees with me. I'm opposed to that legislation, made a speech at the second reading. But again, it was very nice to be in a group of people who came at the question from all sorts of different political backgrounds, to just discuss how we were going to, you know, be talking about this when it comes to committee stage and report stage. And I suppose there is something of an enjoyable aspect of forming some kind of solidarity with people you agree with, regardless of their political background. And there's a lot of people who, in the present circumstances, because of the Sunday Times article and people saying that they buy their way into the Lords talking about corruption, there's a lot of people, rightly in my opinion, questioning the role of the Lords, questioning its democratic mandate, which it doesn't have. A lot of people calling for the abolition of the House of Lords. All of these are legitimate questions. I support completely the idea that there's an undemocratic nature of the House of Lords. We're not elected. We've all been basically placed there, you know, and that's a real problem. But I'm there, and whilst I'm there, I intend to try and raise political questions that don't get a hearing elsewhere, to try and draw attention to some problems in British politics. And so I hope that I carry on being able to use this place. Abolish it as quick as you want, right? I'm all for that. But whilst I'm here, I intend to use this for some good, and I think there are other people in there who, to be fair, are also doing the same. So keep watching the space.